Hello and welcome to Democracy for Sale. I'm just going to give everyone a moment to join, give everyone a chance to join the chat, join the conversation. Okay, I'm going to get started. Hello, I'm Peter Gagan. I'm the editor of the investigative newsletter Democracy for Sale, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Franz Wild. Franz runs the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is one of the UK's leading investigative newsrooms. And like Democracy for Sale, the Bureau is an outlet that's been on both sides of today's story. And today's story is what we call SLAP, Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. But simply, really, it's how the rich and the powerful are able to use our libel courts to silence criticism, to silence journalists and other people who are saying things they want to hear about. But before we dive into that, I actually just want to talk a little bit for a moment about how things stand with this issue. There's supposed to be a debate in the House of Commons this afternoon on SLAPs, and it hasn't actually been cancelled officially yet, but it's pretty much up in the air. And the reason it's up in the air is there's a lot of scheduling chaos because Andy Burnham's about to become the Prime Minister. Nigel Farage has triggered a by-election in Clacton. And the reason I mention this, I think it's quite an important way into our conversation because it tells you something important. I think it says that, like reform, the kind of changes that would stop SLAPs depends on Parliament finding the time, the goodwill, and actually a stable news cycle to act. And when things are chaotic like they are now, issues like SLAPs that really should be cross-party, that really matter, that have a huge public interest, they often get bumped, delayed, or just quietly dropped. And what we're trying to do today, I think, is kind of to push against that. We're going to talk about what SLAPs actually are. We're going to talk about what happens, how painful, difficult it is when you're sued. But we're also going to be talking about the reporting that we've been doing at Democracy for Sale and the Bureau has been doing as well about how people have been lobbying against SLAPs reform. And hopefully we're going to talk about how things could actually change. We'll take some questions from you at the end, so please think about them, put them in the chat. But I think, Franz, let's just start at the beginning. You know, for someone who's never heard this term SLAPs before, what are they talking about? What is a SLAP?
Hey, Peter, thanks for having us on. It's great to be chatting about this. SLAP, so I think you said SLAP stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation, which is a bit of a mouthful, but fundamentally what it means is you're using the law to threaten someone with a libel lawsuit, and you're doing it in a way that is vexatious. So basically, you know, the story about you is wrong. Is true. The story about you is true, but you're just using it to shut down. It can be the victim of fraud, the victim of sexual assault, a whistleblower, politician, academic, journalist. So this is a really, really kind of pervasive problem around society.
And you've had quite a lot of experience of this yourself. You know, like you've had. You've been in the victims of lawsuits, and actually so have I. We both the Bureau and Open Democracy. When I was there, I had a similar case to do with our reporting on the former authoritarian leader of Kazakhstan and some Kazakh oligarchs. Like, what's it like? What's it like when you receive a letter? Can you just kind of talk us through, you know, what happens?
I mean, so the first thing that happens, and usually it starts, this is the dangerous part, it starts before you actually publish the story, because at some point you've done your investigation, you've figured out what the allegations are, and then any responsible journalist will actually go to the people you're writing about, and you'll put the allegations to them, and you'll give them a fair chance to respond, and you'll consider their response and take that on board. But often what happens is before you even publish anything, they'll already start threatening. They'll already say, if you get this wrong, we're going to sue you, fundamentally. So then you publish, then you get another letter, which basically says the same thing. And in our case, so we were sued, as you say, for a story. We both did a sort of similar story. This was in connection with funds ostensibly held for Kazakhstan's former president and dictator in London. So there's like billions of dollars sitting in London, and we were just kind of raising the question, what the hell is it doing in London? And we get these letters, and we basically say, look, we've got our facts straight, we're all good, thank you very much. And they start escalating it. And you know, if you're an inexperienced reporter, it can be pretty scary, and it's, you know, you don't know what's going to happen, because you know immediately that if you just the costs of going into litigation are so astronomically high that you could ruin an organization. You could spend your whole team's budget for the year. If you were personally sued, which is a common tactic, so if it's your name, Peter Gagan is on it, well, then you might lose your home above your head, because these lawsuits can go into the millions. And that's really where the big problem is. In our case, we sort of got through the lawsuit, we'd done all our homework, and we kind of had the backbone to stand up to it. But not everyone else is in that same position. So even if the story's right, you might be more inclined to say, you know what, it's not worth the fight, I'm going to take my story down.
And has this ever happened? Has there been stories that you didn't publish because of this?
I don't think there were stories we didn't. If we knew a story was strong and if we knew it was important, we would publish it. But we actually did this project a couple of years back, where we found all these stories that hadn't been published, and a lot of them were kind of local media or trade media. The smaller organizations that maybe didn't have the experience or the resources to stand up to these lawsuits. And so what we found was a lot of these stories had been silenced. So we had this, and we actually worked with MPs to air these stories in Parliament, and that was a really great way to kind of raise a bit of awareness.
And so you kind of because it's quite a good moment to talk to people about the state of play as well, because we were promised legislative change. We were promised back in 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, Boris Johnson came out and said, seemed to just discover this was a problem and said, we're going to stop this. We're going to stop what he called, lawfare, Russian oligarchs, because, some of the people using slaps have been Russian oligarchs, foreign oligarchs people wouldn't know about. We're going to do something about it. We're now in 2026, it's over 4 years later, and we still really don't have. What have we got? What's happened and what hasn't?
So there was a big uproar, and there were a few really prominent lawsuits, libel suits, primarily brought by Russian and ex-Soviet claimants. One of them by Evgeny Prigozhin, who's a warlord who was Vladimir Putin's sort of right-hand man and chief brute, and that kind of got everyone's attention. And then ultimately what happened was Parliament passed an amendment to a law. It gets a bit technical, but basically they created an anti-slaps provision, but only quite a narrow one. So it was specifically if you're reporting anything on economic crime, and even then you kind of had to understand or had to prove that the person who was bringing the slap had a kind of mindset to inhibit your reporting. And that's always a really hard thing to do. Then we had a change in government. And I kind of want to come on to this point because this really sticks with me. So Keir Starmer, when he came into government, he basically said, unprovoked, he came out and he said, this is a big issue. He wrote a big op-ed in The Guardian, and he said, this is a big issue and we're going to take this head on. And that was the last thing he did on it, because after that, it was crickets. You couldn't hear anything. And so it's kind of been, it's been a little bit of a dead issue. But maybe I'll hand over to you because, there are some developments now which I think are exciting.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of, I think it was striking for us at Democracy for Sale. We published a big investigation a couple of months ago, myself and Jenna Corduroy, into lobbying effectively, people that you've been writing about as well at the Bureau of France, how claimant lawyers who made a lot of money out of SLAP's case effectively were lobbying the government against bringing in legislation. And at that time, it felt like we were kind of stuck. Not much was happening. We were trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And afterwards, actually, David Lammy was asked in Parliament about this. And he said, look, we're going to bring in legislation. Well, he said, as soon as time allows. Okay, we'll see what that looks like. But there has been more positive developments, actually, as well as not only was supposed to be this debate in Parliament today about SLAPs, but also there's been there's been a backbench private members bill from John Wishingdale in the House of Commons and also from Baroness Style in the Lords. And so what it does look like is there is now coming an across-party pressure to try and see some action on this. So, which does feel like, how hopeful are you, Franz, that this is something that we might actually start to see something happening on? Because it feels as if there's been a very strong lobbying attempt against this happening.
Yeah, and I think that the lobbying story you guys did was fantastic, and we've done similar stuff along those lines, and it just shows kind of what the vested interests are that you're up against. And I think the fact this has been building, I think, since 2022, and a lot of us, there's sort of a group of people, there's a UK anti-SLAPP coalition, and I think we've done quite a good job at working together in one shape or form to make sure people are aware of what's going on. And we had a previous private members bill, which only fell away because the election was called in 2024. And now, now we've got these new bills, and I am hopeful because there's a cross-party coalition. This is fundamentally an easy win for any government. I mean, why would you not just push this through? There's no real cost politically. The only thing is that because it's not been as big a political issue, people haven't really, there's not been a real incentive to drive it through. But the fact that we've got two private members bills, I'm quite hopeful about it. We've got a kind of reading date, all of that. I think there's real sort of opportunity here.
And I think one thing that's worth talking about a little bit as well is the imbalance. Like Democracy for Sale, we're funded by our readers. You guys are, we're small newsrooms. Both Democracy for Sale and the Bureau are independent. We don't have some big owners. We are often going up against big targets. I think both you and I think that a big part of the role of us is to hold powerful people to account, whether it's in politics, corporates, and others. And there is a real imbalance. These are people who've got, whether they're oligarchs or people who are able to pay for reputation management firms to go and lobbyists to lobby for them. Like, it's a huge imbalance of power. And I think one thing that people often don't understand when it comes to SLAPPs is they think, people should be allowed to protect their reputation, which I agree with. The problem in the UK is the cost is just so huge. Like, to go to the High Court, you're talking millions and millions. Some cases you could have fees of up to £10 million. That's just, and even just having preliminary hearings, what we call a hearing on meaning, what do the words mean, that can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. So that makes it really difficult for people like us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and I think the press in this country has a bad reputation, and I think there's good reason for that. I think parts of the press don't behave particularly well, but so there's this sort of sense that the press are just digging dirt up and that sort of thing. So let's be really clear what this is about. This is about organizations, your newsletter, Democracy for Sale, Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and there's many of other amongst us. We're doing investigations to hold powerful people who are doing wrong things, who are doing bad things, to account. We're exposing corruption. We're driving accountability. And this is being stopped. This is really, really being stopped. And nobody's worried that they haven't done their homework. Nobody thinks their story isn't strong enough. You might never get to court because the costs of getting to court are so expensive. And if you look at Europe, for example, a whole lawsuit might cost you, say, 30 grand, 40 grand, something like that. Here, I mean, I can't go into the figures on our lawsuit, but I can say it was hundreds of thousands of pounds. Many lawsuits go into the millions, and it's just like of an order that you can't really imagine. There was one question is, we obviously had this little amendment about that anti-SLAPPs amendment that came into effect recently, and it has been tried out once now, and that actually worked in a sense because you got an early dismissal of that particular case. But even the costs in that case for the defendant were £140,000, £140,000, and it hadn't even got to court really. And again, like what often happens. So in our case, what happened was this dragged along for 2 years, and then literally we were about to go to court, and then they go, oh, you know what? We're not going to go through with that. And there's this one case of a young American journalist who was basically investigating this oligarch, and he was such as your own newsletter. He'd started his own outlet, and he was not actually based in the UK. He'd never been to England, but he got sued here. He had to fly over, and he was, for the first time ever, I don't even know if he got to see Big Ben or anything, but he was basically got there, and the next day was the trial. That night they settled, or they pulled out, because they weren't actually serious about going through with it. And that just kind of shows it's fundamentally a tool for intimidation, not for actually figuring out what the truth is.
And I think it's possibly worth like just drilling down into one or two specific examples of this. I think the one that both you guys and we have reported on a bit is the case of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Now, people remember Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's chef. He was he died a few years ago in mysterious circumstances in a fireball somewhere over Moscow in a plane that just happened to go explode. But Yevgeny Prigozhin had been the leader of the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenaries. And back in around 2022, Elliot Higgins and Bellingcat did a series of stories, effectively basically showing how government contracts were going to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Really important stories, really important public interest stories about the role of this guy who was running this mercenary group, this group that was fighting in Syria, fighting in the Sahel, fighting in places like Mali, in Libya, these other places, and soon will be fighting in Ukraine. Elliot, at the time, Yevgeny Prigozhin was under British sanctions for his role in the Wagner Group. He was able to sue Elliot Higgins in London for, I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing, but I think it was emotional distress of being suggested he was involved with the Wagner Group, despite being under sanctions at the time. And when I was at Open Democracy, we did a big, huge, important story. Jim Fitzpatrick did a really, really great story about how the British government had actually given Prigozhin express permission, and his law firm, a firm called Discreet Law, interesting name, no longer exists, to sue Elliot Higgins in London. The case basically, ended when the tanks rolled into Ukraine, leaving Elliot Higgins with a £70,000 legal bill. Prigozhin was seen weeks later with, literally a machine gun in posting videos from Ukraine. It just felt like a case. And then there was the thing that really struck me. We got the documents last year at Democracy for Sale. There'd been in the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, the body overseeing solicitors. Elliot Higgins had wrote to them complaining about this case, asking to investigate. It took them 2 years. They produced like a 3 or 4 page report that said nothing had been done. This wasn't a slap and no rules were broken. And it was just like, if suing somebody in London for claiming that they're the head of a mercenary group that they are clearly the head of, that the British government is sanctioning at the time, doesn't count as a slap, it kind of felt like, well, what does?
Yeah. And I think it's worth talking about that a bit more. And, so we've got this regulator, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, and they do, last year they did bring a slap suit, and they brought a couple now. And what's interesting is none of them have been successful. And the sort of lawyers on the side of the oligarchs and the slappers, let's call them that, will argue, well, that there isn't a case to answer. But if you look at the actual substance of it, it's pretty strong. And so what strikes me is that the whole the framework basically doesn't work. You have a regulator who kind of has a mandate to hold these law firms to account, but isn't able to execute that mandate. And so, that's a sort of secondary problem, and it speaks to a wider problem in the UK, that a lot of these kind of regulators and enforcement bodies either don't have the powers, or don't have the resources, or don't have the expertise, or whatever it is, to kind of perform their duties, and that just creates this environment where you have basically the rich and powerful, taking advantage of a sort of unjust system.
I guess then, let's kind of bringing it back then to where we are now. It feels as if we're in a situation where the way in which the law is able to be used, and I think it's actually worth flagging as well, it's not just journalists. It's journalists who often get, and I think you're right, Franz, as well. Sometimes journalists are not the most sympathetic voices for this.
Yeah.
And people will go, look, you're journalists. What are you complaining about, frankly? And, you know, and I'm aware, if you look at like kind of levels of trust, our profession's kind of up there with politicians or down there with politicians. But I think the other part of this that doesn't get enough focus is it's not just journalists. You know, we've written about, I'm sure, I think you guys have too, victims of sexual assault. We've even had crazy things like people who've written, you know, reviews on the internet. They've been hit with slaps. Like, this is becoming a tool to try and silence people in many different walks of life.
Yeah, I think so. There's two things. One is the sexual assault victims. I think that for me is kind of the most powerful scenario, because you've basically, in all the cases I'm aware of, at least, are women victims of sexual assault or worse, and because their assailants, the sexual predators, are rich men. They're able to shut them up for years. And we know this happened with Al Fayed, with Jimmy Savile, we know this. And we even know, and there are kind of more recent cases. So there's a hedge fund manager called Chris Benodi. You know, he actually took the Financial Times to court. They did a big expose of his sexual predatory. And in the end, he also basically pulled out. Sorry, I forget now whether he pulled out or whether his case was thrown out. But
no, he pulled out. He was told the case. It was very clear he wasn't going to win, and he mounted some. He admitted that he wasn't going to win, but said that he would have won. He should have won anyway, effectively. Yeah. But it was fascinating. The FT then wrote the kind of inside story of what had happened, and they kind of described. I think both you and I have experienced this, Franz. The huge amount of time, you know, like the first that's involved, the time and the energy trying to respond to these things behind the scenes. Like, it's very easy for someone to use this, to pull this lever if they've got money, knowing that it's not just that they're going to try and stop you reporting, but they're going to suck up all your time, which means you don't report more on them.
Yeah. And actually, I always think it's kind of ironic because, so for example, when we had this case running for 2 years, I was working on that, let's just say, half a day a week. You know, I had to have my eye on it all the time. It didn't mean I was doing less on the guys who were suing us, because I was focused on them all the time and we continued doing stories on them. It meant I was doing less on other people. So, but ironically, I mean, if you think about the Chris Benodi case, you know, the fact that he sued, it just turned it into an even bigger story. You know, the actor Noel Clarke with the Guardian is similar story. It just, you know, if anything, it kind of in the end destroyed their reputation even further. The one other story that we did a while ago kind of really stands out to me. This is a woman who lives in a council flat in Scotland called Jen McAdam. And she had a modest inheritance from her dad, and she invested that in OneCoin, which was the big $4 billion crypto fraud. So it pretended like it was a cryptocurrency. Actually, it was just a big Ponzi scheme. And she lost all of her money. And then at some point, she kind of realized she wasn't going to get anything back. So she tried to warn other people online by posting stuff. And she got a letter basically telling her to take her stuff down or she would go to court. And this is from Carter Ruck, which is, you know, the most prestigious sort of libel law firm in London. And, you know, she was panicking. She had no experience of this. She is literally just a very regular person, isn't engaged in this stuff day in, day out, like we are. And she actually really panicked. And there were multiple cases like that of victims of investment schemes who ended up really, really scared and basically erasing everything. And again, like in connection with that, Carter Ruck, the partner at Carter Ruck involved, was charged by the SRA with a slap in that. But that case was thrown out. And it's just crazy to me because we know from following the case, the judge actually who overheard the case said that Carter Ruck had been acting in furtherance of a fraud. You know, obviously Carter Ruck denied this. They said they did nothing wrong. They've got the obligation to work for their clients. But the facts, you know, the facts kind of speak for themselves. This fraud was continuing. Carter Ruck were continuing to act for them. The police were actually investigating, and Carter Ruck were writing to the police in their own words to give them pause. They were also writing to the financial regulator, telling them to take down warning notices, which the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, were doing. So you kind of see how it's not just sort of taking down that one story. It's attacking very vulnerable people, and it's creating this whole culture of silence in society, so that there's no transparency. Big corruption can continue.
And I think actually it's fair to say, like, there was for a long time a bit of a culture of silence around this in journalism too. A lot of journalists didn't talk about this. They didn't talk about these things, and I think that's something that the likes of the society media lawyers who we've written about have been able to take advantage of, because a lot of these cases don't come to court, so it's very hard to say this has happened, and that's what their argument is, and it's their argument to us and to you. They push back strongly and say, look, the likes of us are just overstating it. But I was really struck. I felt like we kind of, when I'd opened Democracy, myself and Mary Fitzgerald, who was then the editor, we wrote a piece about how Jeffrey Donaldson, who was running at the time to be the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, had sued us. He'd sued me personally, and I should say Jeffrey Donaldson has now been sentenced to prison to do with issues that this was completely unrelated to my reporting. My reporting about his business and his funding, the political funding of the Brexit campaign. Through the DUP in 2016, so it was separate to that. But Jeffrey Donaldson had sued me personally, and effectively what he'd done, been able to, we see this time and again where you don't end up in court. Technically, you don't actually end up in court, but technically people are able to use levers to continue the process. So the process dragged out for 2 years. Yeah. And in that process, as a small organization, as you said, we were having to deal with huge amounts of legal correspondence, and in a jurisdiction in Northern Ireland which didn't have any defamation reform. So we did have some reform in 2013 here in the UK, and which has reduced some of the costs, at least the costs in terms of what the costs are given out. But in Northern Ireland at that stage, they hadn't had any, so there's huge potential costs. And I felt like when we went public with that, it was, the amount of people that got in touch, the amount of journalists said, I've had the exact same thing. And actually one journalist in Northern Ireland contacted me saying that his newspaper would just routinely pay out to politicians, both the DUP and others in Northern Ireland, small amounts of money when they would threaten him. And he told me some incredible stories. He said they basically treated them like an ATM machine. And the newspaper groups felt like it was cheaper just to give them $5 grand, 20 grand here and there, rather than to even risk going to court. And that has been, I think there's been a lot of that behind the surface that we haven't seen that's been part of, I think, of how journalism operated for a very long time, actually.
Yeah, that's so shocking. Peter, I know we need to wrap up relatively soon, but I wanted to ask you how you're feeling about things at the moment, because it is quite hard to read the picture. And there are obviously some positive signs, but there've also been some pretty big negative signs, let's put it that way.
I think it's a really good question. I think we have a new administration coming in. This doesn't feel, I think, as I kind of said at the top of this, what we've got is we've got an issue like SLAPs, which really should be a cross-party issue. This shouldn't be a left or right issue. This should be cross-party. It should be people, and we've had politicians. John Whittingdale has brought forward a private members bill as a Tory. We've had a lot of Labour support for this too. Alex Sobel is supposed to be talking today in Parliament on SLAPs. So this should be cross-party. I think the big challenge for us, though, is going to be making sure that it is, making that actually happen, making sure that we get people coming together on this, because there's a danger that it becomes something that a new administration, new government comes in and they just don't make it a priority.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there were definitely several Labour MPs who are behind this as well. I've lost you there, Peter. Yeah, there are Labour MPs who are all behind this issue, and Lib Dems and others as well. So SNP. So I know this is a cross-party issue, and I kind of think it is a bit of an easy win. Interestingly, I was chatting with a lawyer friend who was sort of saying, look, all the protections are kind of there. It's just the judges who aren't strong enough on this. But whatever it is, it is clearly something that needs to be sorted out.
It is, thanks. And I think, Franz, it is. I think it's something that if, we need, and I'm quite open with what it looks like. I think the big question is, how do you protect people like us, ordinary people like journalists, but also ordinary people, so that they don't have to face this. And there's other threats to being public on things, people around data protection or issues. And I think the big thing for me is, whether it's called slaps or it's called something else, it's about allowing people, we hear a lot of people talking about free speech. There's lots of people who care about free speech. Well, this should be something that they really care about. So that's where I come down on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Franz, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining today. It's been really, really fascinating discussion. I think it's really interesting. I hope people have taken away that something needs to be done with this. I just would like to say, if you don't already, do sign up to TBIJ's newsletters. They've got a suite of great newsletters. You can follow Democracy for Sale as well on our newsletter if you go to our Substack page, or democracyforsale.uk. And also, I just want to make it quick before I wrap up. Just one more live political development I wanted to flag. It's not to do with slaps, but I think it's very much in the same territory. The elections bill is back in Parliament next week. It's something we've written about a lot. And, I've said it, others have said it, the current bill doesn't go far enough to clean up our politics. I'm not the only one, I think, who's thinking this. So a little bit of good news is that 2 Labour MPs, Stella Creasy and Annalise Dodds, have tabled 2 separate amendments. One of these will cap political donations at £100,000, and the other will reduce campaign spending limits. And I'd really urge everyone here to write to their MP today to encourage them to support these amendments. They're clauses 70 and 71. That's new clause 70 and new clause 71 in the elections bill. It's a small ask and it's a small act, but it's exactly the kind of thing that makes a difference. And it's the kind of moment where a few hundred emails to MPs could really shift things. So yeah, if you can, please do that. And thanks again for coming along today. It's been a huge pleasure to talk to you, Franz. And yeah, thanks a million.
Thanks, Peter. It's been good fun. And thanks everyone for tuning in.